to you all. Not sure whether we're still allowed to say that. Is it 19th of January? How long can you keep going with that? Maybe that'll be our quiz for this session of teissTalk. Welcome to you all. Welcome to a new 2023 session of teissTalks. My name is Jeff White. I'll be your host for today's session. I'll be your host for every session on Thursdays, at least for the foreseeable future. Great to have you all with us. There's a little public chat window there that you can dial into and say hello to us all there. Do get involved. We'd love to hear from our Teiss audience. Welcome to you if you're joining us for the first time. Hello to all of you who are welcoming you back from previous sessions. It's great to have you all with us. I'll be honest, we've had some tech gremlins so far on our teissTalk. Maybe 2023 is starting off with a bit of a bang. I don't know, but we are welcoming some people back who've been with us before and getting through the tech gremlins. So fantastic. Thanks for having you all with us. If you're listening to us on the podcast version, by the way, you're not getting the full experience. If you want the full 40 minutes of Teiss, do check us out online. You can see all of our teissTalks archived on the website, teiss.co.uk. Fantastic. We are going to be talking about all the top issues in tech security in our sessions coming up in the next few weeks. We're going to be concentrating this time on IP and keeping our IP safe from malicious activity. But before that, I do want to ask our Teiss audience, because I'm interested in this, how long should you keep saying Happy New Year to people? What is the acceptable cutoff date? Has it passed already, or are you going to keep it going? So please put in the chat what your cutoff date for Happy New Yearing to people is. And who knows, if I get an interesting answer, I may give them a prestigious teissTalk mug to give away, to send off to them. So good to see you all. Hello, Stuart. Hello, Obiadun. Hello, Alan. Hello to all of you. Happy New Year if it's not too late. Neil, yes, never too late on this show. We are going to be talking today, as I say, about IP safety and IP security and so on. We've got a great panel to talk to us. I'm going to welcome them now. We've got Danny Dresner, who's Professor of Cybersecurity at University of Manchester, Josh Copeland, who is Cybersecurity Director at AT&T, Lucy Marlowe, Intellectual Property Senior Associate at JMW Solicitors LLP, and Steve Audsley, who's EMEA Solution Engineering Manager for Data Protection at Fortra, which, Steve, is quite a mouthful. Did you have an option to go for a shorter job title, or was that the one you picked?
That was the best I could come up with.
Fair enough. And I think we may still be waiting for Lucy to come online. Yes, we're still working on getting Lucy online, but don't worry, she'll be joining us fairly shortly, I'm sure. Danny, welcome back. Hello to you. How was your festive season, New Year, etc.?
Oh, it was terrific, and I'm already looking forward to next year, because they made one of my presents was a whiskey making kit.
Oh.
It says 4 to 5 weeks on the instructions, but I've been tipped off that it's better to leave it for a year. So I'm going to start my own label. I'm going to call it Old Dan's Shine.
Nice. Wait, how? I mean, I've visited a whiskey distillery, Danny, and don't get me wrong. I know you're skilled and everything, but it's a very advanced process. How does it work?
Well,
Christmas present
that was my immediate thought. I thought, where am I going to put the kegs, etc., etc.? But no, you get the alcohol, and they give you all these different barks. So you actually put the keg inside the bottle, as it were. You put the bark inside the bottle.
Right, I see. Well, this reminds me, I got bought a gin making kit one year, and again, I did think to myself, isn't making your own spirits at home illegal? But their advice was get a bottle of vodka. And then they give you some sort of juniper berries and stuff, and you put the juniper berries in the vodka, and you make gin. Oh, there you go. Yep. And I followed the instructions. Don't get me wrong, I did do it, but at the end, what I got was sort of juniper flavored vodka. I mean, it's still you can't change. It's literally a different drink. You can't just suddenly make vodka into gin. Anyway, there we go. But anyway, good luck to you with that, and Danny. We'll look forward to raising a glass with you next year. Josh, how are you, and where are you joining us from?
I'm very well. I'm joining you from Bossier City, Louisiana, over in the States.
Oh, nice. Fantastic. What's that like? I've never been there. I've never even been to Louisiana. What's that like?
It's America with a French flair.
I like it. And Steve, how are you, and where are you joining us from?
Yeah, very well. Thank you. I'm near Reading. So we have our main office is about 10 minutes from where I live. But it's we're suffering mostly around here from the weather is breaking up the roads, so it's not doing anyone's suspension any good at the moment.
Fair enough. And Josh, just to let you know, Reading is a bit like the UK, but with no French twist.
None.
So apologies to all of the Reading people out there. Apologies about that. Well, listen, we're going to get started on this. Before we do leap into the IP business, we're going to pick up on a news story which our Teiss Goblin spotted and picked out, which we thought was quite an interesting one. This is in the August publication Dark Reading. who is the writer on this? I always like to credit the writer. Elizabeth Montalbano. Well done, Elizabeth. Is talking about an AWS type attack. Now, you guys have read this, and our Tice audience will be well aware that I'm not particularly technically skilled. So if I get this wrong, do please correct me. As I understand it, with this, if you use AWS, Amazon Web Services, you can be given an IP address by them that you can then have as your static IP address. What this seems to be going on about is a possibility that that can be stolen from you. Somebody can use your Amazon Web Services IP address and do all sorts of nefarious things because they've got hold of your IP address. Josh, Steve, have I got that roughly right from where you're sitting? I mean, you guys are the techies.
Yeah, you've got it spot on. What makes this particularly nefarious is that you have all these security devices throughout your enterprise that are tied back to things that say only accept traffic from this particular IP address or only route traffic to this kind of IP address. And by stealing that, you're essentially stealing that company's internet identity, which allows you to kind of circumvent a lot of those security functionalities.
Steve, what did you make of this? I mean, I was interested by the idea that for some companies, it seemed that the IP address was what dictated what they let through their sort of firewalls. And what do you think?
So so that's the IP is typically used as a kind of a governance piece through security tools and so forth. But as we see with the likes of Amazon and so forth, they have vast arrays of customers, and so they have to find ways of sort of sharing and reusing and so forth. For me, while this on face value appears quite terrible, the thing for me was what you needed to achieve this vulnerability, and you needed to have access, or you needed to have credentials for someone's AWS environment. This felt less about a vulnerable system that AWS had created, and more about an issue around credentials theft and so forth. It's a bit like, I guess it's a bit like me saying that a database server is vulnerable. I know a way that you can egress all of the data from it, but the requirement is you need the system administrator credentials. Of course, you've got the keys to the house. If you've got the credentials and you've got the privileges associated with it, then you've got the keys to the house. I would say if someone's able to do that in your environment, you've got bigger problems because they're in your house already. So
So
I mean, that's really my take on it.
I think that's a good point, Stevie. I'm glad you raised that, because I had that same thought reading through it. I mean, Danny, if you had access to somebody's AWS account, are there loads of other things that you would do before you got to the stage of thinking, right, now I'm going to hijack their IP address and do things with it?
Well, it depends what your original objectives are. I mean, two things struck me from this article. First was your clever gambit to try and confuse us with having two different meanings for IP during the podcast. But also, it was the mitigation. To mitigate these, the recommendations are sort of like Security 101. 101.
Least privilege,
exactly.
Least privilege, and also disabling anything which isn't used, which of course is the advice to well-known water treatment plants in America and TeamViewer.
Interesting. Hello to you, Lucy. Thanks for joining us. Apologies, I think we had a few gremlins getting you started. Whereabouts are you joining us from, and how are you doing?
Hi. Yeah, I'm from my home in London.
Okay, good stuff. It's very good to have you with us. There's a bit of an echo, but it seems to have sorted itself out. So let's sort of persevere with that. And as Danny says, we have cunningly used the two different meanings of IP for Internet Protocol and, of course, intellectual property. So I've been talking about the IP address aspect of it. We'll shortly be moving on to the Internet Protocol sort of aspect of that. And Lucy, can I come to you on that front first? Because obviously, you're working in IP for a firm of lawyers. I guess, what I'd like to do first is talk about the extent to which organizations actually understand what intellectual property they've got and how to value it. Can you talk us through that when you go in with a client? How does that sort of conversation work? And have you got, ways that you go about getting an answer to that question?
Yeah, so IP is so broad and like vast. It arises because it protects intangible concepts, that it arises in so many different things that often clients are creating it all the time, but they're not actually aware of that. Obviously very important, like confidential information, often clients do know what that is, but for example, you know, the source code to their software, for example, various different literary documents, images, all those kinds of things, their branding, their trademarks. Maybe, for example, they've got enough technology that they could apply for a patent, but they actually haven't considered doing so. Database rights that they have. A lot of clients aren't often fully aware of what rights they already have, or they assume they have rights, but they later find out actually they don't. For example, if they contracted with a third party to create software for them, well, unless you expressly assign, say, the copyright in that software, the company won't actually be the owner. So as part of my practice, how we help our clients is that we can do, for example, IP audits. And what we basically do is, you know, lift up the bonnet of the car effectively and have a look at a business and just check that everything is in place. So going back to, say, the software points, you know, just checking that actually the contracts do assign the rights that are being created, for example. And then often the result of that exercise is, like most things, you find really good stuff and other stuff where actually there are measures that you can take to maximize the protection that that you can gain through the whole intellectual property regime.
Just sticking with you on that, Lucy, for the second, with that IP audit, I mean, it sounds like an interesting process, maybe a painful process for some people, but to what extent then can you value those different bits of IP? Do you do that as you go along, you know, and how do you actually work out, you know, the value of the different bits of IP that you're revealing as part of that audit process?
Well, there are like specialist providers of those services, but I think often, for example, take Coca-Cola, you know, they've got a recipe for their Coke. That's a trade secret. That's confidential information. Obviously, anyone that gets their hands on that is in possession of highly valuable information. So, I mean, the value of that is quite obvious, but there are companies out there that can, you know, put a number on that, and it requires, you know, very specific knowledge of the particular market and the sector in question. But it's really important, I think, just at the outset, that exercise in and of itself is of great assistance.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, can I come to you on this? I'm interested from a sort of technical point of view, among the sort of products that you work with and experiences you've had. To what extent are there technical tools, automated tools, maybe, that can help with this process, or is it going to be always a sort of more of a hands-on human?
In terms of identifying intellectual property or protecting?
In terms of identifying it, yeah.
So it's a big challenge, actually. It's part of one of the major challenges around trying to apply data protection programs. The origins of data protection, you know, were based primarily around reading content and understanding the content. And you know, a simple example is recognizing a credit card file, or looking for keywords and so forth. And that works and is still heavily used in many places and can be reasonably effective. The challenge you have with intellectual property is the varying ways that it presents itself, whether it could be a CAD drawing, or whether it could be, you know, a memo, or whatever that might be. And how do you define the content check that you're looking for to make a determination on that's intellectual property? So that's the sort of the challenge when we come from the kind of the sort of the old school way of approaching data protection. There are other things you can do now. A lot of capabilities out there now are things leveraging context rather than content. So you're actually looking at where it's come from, how it's being used, who's doing it, when they're doing it, and so forth. So you kind of pull those kind of parameters together to then make, on the basis of all these things adding together, I can fairly safely say that that is a piece of intellectual property that we need to apply these kind of controls to. The kind of the utopia, and we get asked it all the time. You get the machine learning and
I was going to ask about that.
Words thrown out there all the time. It's still a massive challenge. It's still not been something that what customers really want is they want you to produce a tool that goes in there, looks at all the data, and just knows what's important to you. And unfortunately, that just doesn't exist at the moment. And I think even if there are capabilities to do that, the compute power and so forth is so, it wouldn't be something you could just drop on someone's laptop, to be able to achieve this. So it's still a balancing act where the tools aren't quite there, and there's still always a sort of a people and a process element to it. There's no magic tool, unfortunately. I'd love to say there is, but there is no magic element to it. So it is a case of trying to leverage as much context as you can, leveraging the tools that are available, and building processes and so forth around it to try and identify the things that are most important to an organization.
Thanks, Steve. Interesting. Josh, can I come to you on this? I mean, obviously, AT&T, a huge company, but it's interesting. I was thinking in the lead up to this session, I don't hear cybersecurity people talk about intellectual property that much. I mean, they talk about data getting access and stuff getting hacked, which is when information goes, it is intellectual property. But that phrase doesn't seem to sort of come up very much. Is that your experience too, or with an AT&T, do you do it slightly differently?
I think that's kind of a universal experience. And it kind of goes back to Lucy's point of a lot of organizations just really don't know what their intellectual property is. From my technical perspective as a cybersecurity professional, I will do everything I can to wrap items in the appropriate layers and security controls with the appropriate access requirements, but I have to know what those are. I can't tell the business, these are your really, really important bits of information. This is your, financial data. This is your unique intellectual property that is your secret sauce. It tells you, how you're making your product, what makes it unique or different than anybody else's. That's something that you have to kind of have that cross-functional business organization saying, these are the things that we are very keen on protecting and preventing, our competitors from getting access to. This is what makes us the standout organization or standout product. And once we can kind of have that organizational view and say, these are the things that are important that I need to protect, then folks like, me, Stephen, and Danny can come in and wrap them in the appropriate controls, throw things like data loss prevention, do appropriate data tagging, and treat it like, the government does with, classifications, but it comes down to, you have to know what you need to protect first.
Yeah. Interesting. A few comments in the chat. Well, one from Stuart as well. Thanks for that, Stuart. Says, interesting, the latest big breaches of LastPass, etc. Also, the hackers also went for source code. Lock up your repositories, he says, the criminals are coming. That's a good point. Thanks for that, Stuart. Danny, can I come to you on this? Because Josh raised an interesting point there about how whose job it is to work out what intellectual property you've got and therefore then to protect it. Have you got a sort of view on that in terms of how much IT security professionals should get involved in those conversations?
Oh, I think the IT security professionals have to be the catalyst, because the people generating the IP are going to be focused on doing that. Part of the problem, and it's always down to the life cycle, because you've got stuff which is in existence, you've got stuff which is going to be useful in the future, some stuff which may never be useful, and some stuff which is like in pieces and by themselves doesn't have a lot of value, but when put together, and it might not necessarily be you who realizes that value. When they come together, it's a bit like that old cartoon, the Ring and Shazam, and some magic happens. But I'm just thinking kind of in recent times, who would have understood the value of mRNA technology, which has been, which was discovered some time back. Was sitting on the shelf, a bit like lasers. I remember a kid. There was a Horizon documentary. Perhaps I remember it because it was narrated by Patrick Troughton, and they described lasers as solutions looking for problems.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
it's that value, it's that valuation. And when you get academics doing stuff, they may actually be focused on solving the problem, not necessarily be interested on how much money they can make out of it.
Yeah, interesting. I just wondered also, I mean, I talked about cybersecurity people not tending to use intellectual property as a sort of phrase that often. Danny, have you found that as well? If so, what do you think's behind that?
I think it's actually quite a powerful thing, because we try and describe, the components, and talk to people and try to get people's idea of what they need in terms of confidentiality, integrity, which is extremely important from the, discuss that enough when it comes to things like intellectual property and availability. And it's when you mention intellectual property and the value in that often sort of the clouds part, and people get to understand, yes, this is actually why we need to do it. Sometimes you have to come a little bit heavy, because of course this is probably more something for kind of for Lucy to discuss. You've got legal obligations in terms of export controls.
Yeah.
It's a difficult area, because in theory I understand that, particularly with certain countries, if I open my mouth in a lecture and talk about stuff, and it might be an idea, and I have to be very careful not to talk about things which are kind of in development in certain places, etc., etc. Somebody hears that, then goes home to a certain list of countries. I might have illegally exported intellectual property.
Interesting. Yeah. Stuart again commented, cyber vendors says don't talk about protecting IP because we call it cybersecurity, not information security. Put it back to the data. Interesting comment. Thanks for that. Again, Stuart. Lucy, can I come to you then on this issue of sort of who's making the decisions about the intellectual property? In your experience then, where does that conversation, if indeed it happens, where does it happen in an organization? Who does it?
The conversation can really sometimes, well, it can come back from all different levels. Like sometimes it could be like the chief technology officer, like we've already mentioned. It could be, the CEO, could be someone in marketing, or you could be like preparing for example, for a sale, and you're just thinking, oh gosh, as part of the due diligence for the sale of the company's assets, we need to, look into what our IP is and the warranties that we'll be signing up to as part of that deal. So that's often sort of where it arises. Or, I often find that it can be a little bit reactionary as well. So, for example, you've had it's become high on the agenda because the risk has presented itself, because a theft has occurred or is about to occur, like an exiting employee, for example, or where, you said there, you find out that they've set up a competing website and business, and they've stolen your client lists, your supplier lists, etc. Or, for example, you've been in collaboration with a third party, developing something, and guess what? They've gone and stolen your idea. And then, we have to then dig through, what's actually gone on. In the case of that collaboration, was an NDA in place? What were the terms that were agreed? And that's often, especially because, part of my practice is also litigation. So it's trying to, obviously we want to protect the assets. We want to identify them, but we also want to, enforce them when things do go wrong. So I think that's often why I do sometimes see things when they've already gone a bit sour.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks for that, Lucy. Neil's commented, one of the biggest threats from IP is the trolls that buy patients that sit lower in the system. That's what sits in the SBOM, Standard Bill of Materials, I think, SBOM, I think I got that right. Danny, you can't leave this one in the chat and not talk about it. You said there's quite a hoo-ha over retaining the IP in Whisper chocolate bars. What, say more?
Well, this goes back to, as the saying goes, when I were a lad. I don't know whether it's still the case, but apparently in those days, the northeast of England was the testing ground for new chocolate ideas. Great place to live then. And Cadbury's came out with the Whisper bar, made a run of this stuff, tried it, and it sold out really, really quickly, and they tried to then suppress how successful it had been. However, this then got back to aero, and if you think back, aero used to be a normal, whatever you call it, break off the bars, with the bubbles in, and all of a sudden the shape of the bar changed. So you had bigger bubbles than the Whisper. Other chocolates are available, but Cadbury's then had the issue of trying to get back that slice segment, whatever bit of the chocolate market, because just that idea of having a long chocolate bar with the bubbles in was their original idea. Of course, how do you suppress something which has come out that far and is probably quite difficult to patent?
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Right. Let's get back to tech security then after that chocolatey detour. Joshua, can I come back to you on this? I mean, you've sort of described a situation where, as I've understood it, decisions about intellectual property will generally be made in other parts of the business. When it comes to you, is it neatly packaged up? Is it a kind of a neat sort of conversation, say, right, we've decided the IP, here it all is, or is it a bit more messy than that in real life?
I think everywhere I've ever been dealing with IP has always been messy. It's just a very nebulous thing where you might not even realize something is IP until you've put 3 pieces together and found, oh, this is intellectual property.
Right.
One of the very first deep research items done by Mandiant on advanced persistent threat was around corporate espionage and taking IP. So this is kind of like the very focus of those APT groups that are not doing the traditional ransomware stuff. They want to get at your intellectual property, and it's really comes down to, do you know what makes whatever you do special? It could be your patents, it could be your process, it could be the data that you have. Customer databases are a huge very useful piece of aggregated data, and that could be your intellectual property that really matters to you, because that's what drives other parts of your business. Your financials can be your IP. It really getting into going with your peers and figuring out what is important to your business. What data do you have? Can you not have and not operate the business?
Yeah, interesting. Steve, can I come to you on something that Lucy mentioned briefly, which I want to expand a bit more on, the insider threat, which is always interesting because obviously the insiders have access often to a lot of bits of your business. Again, in terms of sort of technical tools, what is there available to spot these kind of insider threats, to stop them? Also, you can do things to mitigate, I suppose. You can section bits off of the business so people don't have access to everything. But in terms of spotting that kind of behavioral stuff about insider threat, when they might be after your IP, what's available is the stuff that people can use, and how well do those things work?
So there are lots of tools available to sort of address the insider threat, and the insider threat doesn't necessarily have to be malicious. It can be a drop down in Outlook, picking the wrong Steve from the options presented to you, and you send in the data to the wrong place. So it doesn't have to be malicious. Someone trying to maliciously steal data per se. It can be an accidental leak, and so typically what we're finding now is that a lot of the controls and protection around data loss was often driven in the network, at the egress points in the network, gateways, web and email, and so forth. But I think with the distributed nature of the workforce now, because everyone's working from home, post-COVID, that's kind of exploded. So I think the ability to control at that point is becoming more challenging, and certainly with a lot more cloud services as well that are being leveraged. So it's not sort of a remote device back into the corporate environment. There's a lot more sort of external services. What the focus is now is it tends to be that you need to have something endpoint based that is able to provide the visibility at the very least, but ideally the control and to make sense around the
Yeah.
the activities that someone's saying, that someone's performing. So maybe they're trying to send an email, and you might have something just go, hang on, that doesn't look like something that you should be doing. Are you sure you want to do that, and so forth?
Yeah.
So and with all of these things, the big challenge with data protection that's slightly different from other areas of cybersecurity is a lot of the, you know, your anti-malware capabilities, your network protection, and so forth, all happens under the covers. The end user is typically unaware of these things that are going on, securing them and their data and their business and so forth. The thing about data protection invariably is intrusive. It's dealing with you on a day-to-day basis. It's touching you as you try and work with data. And so critically, there has to be you have to deploy and implement these programs with an element of user engagement. There has to be notifications, there has to be communications. The tools need to sort of communicate with the end user, go, you're doing this, are you sure? There has to be some way to prompt and advise, and that at least leads you down a more an easier to adopt approach, because that can be the challenge, is that you just swamp your IT teams with events and alerts and phone calls and so forth. So ultimately, you're trying to protect the business, you're trying to protect the data, but you don't want to prevent business as well. So it's
of course. Thanks.
Customers have to try and find.
Thanks, Steve. That's interesting. Danny, I want to come on to you on this, because it's interesting. What's coming out of the conversation is the fact that we're talking about intellectual property can actually be quite a powerful tool, I think, for tech security people to wield. You know, with the kind of teaching that you do and the research that you do, should this form more of a conversation for tech security people? You know, can they use this as a kind of way of, because there's always this thing about tech security people trying to get visibility within the business and be taken seriously within the business, and, you know, and I wonder whether, you know, talking more about intellectual property from a tech security point of view will make people outside the tech security world understand the importance of tech security, because you're kind of speaking their language. Am I onto a good thing there, do you think? Is that?
Oh, no, definitely. And actually, that's where there's actually an intersection between that article we were discussing earlier on about, you know, these wonderful cloud facilities and a need for security, because what you get is a conflict between kind of little security and everybody else wanting little security as in being small, as in not having a little security, the small security warrior trying to fight against people who obviously want the right things, such as usability and maintainability, interoperability, reusability, portability, lots of itties, and it's all, but it's not just about the people securing it, it's the people actually designing the business process systems. For there was one firm I was working for, and their intellectual property was a bunch of really, really complex actuarial equations for working out life insurance policies, and the system itself was not. It was okay, but it wasn't, you know, brilliantly fast. And so what people used to do was to download these equations, not realizing how their value, into spreadsheets, give their customers quotes, and they thought they were just inserting those few cells of the spreadsheet into the email. And of course, what they were doing, they were attaching the entire intellectual property every time. And about 3,000 to 6,000 emails a week were going in and out of this company with the intellectual property embedded in it.
Unbelievable. Lucy, can I come back to you on this? Something occurred to me when you were talking earlier that I didn't get to ask, but about the extent to which regulation can drive this. I'm particularly thinking about things like GDPR. Has that helped push that agenda of, you know, get your intellectual property sorted out and therefore you can secure it? To what extent does regulation sort of help, or will we doing this sort of stuff anyway, even without the regulations?
I think it's definitely raised it on people's agenda, because obviously the GDPR, it places additional obligations on companies. So I think it has, it has raised like the profile of these issues. So yeah, I'd say so, yeah, it has made a difference.
Good stuff. Thanks for that. Joshua, can I come back to you on this? There's a talking point on our list here, which I wanted to bring up, which is convincing senior leadership to implement an IP protection plan. But from what you've said, I'm not entirely sure whether that is sort of tech security's thing to do, or is it? Unwrap that a bit for me.
So it's absolutely within, tech security's wheelhouse, because ultimately we're the ones that have to, implement those types of solutions. So it really comes down to explaining what the value is of putting these kind of controls in place. Danny mentioned it, the usability, accessibility, being able to do all those abilities is always a critical thing. And obviously security tends to be kind of one of those things that makes those things harder. But when you talk to your, business counterparts, your CFO, your CIO, your CEO, when you start unwrapping and explaining, look, if we lose this data, we lose this return on our investment. This is where we're going to lose money by losing this data. It's going to go to get sold on black market, go to China, and they're going to make our product for pennies on the dollar. And when you translate, these security requirements and security requests into business dollars and cents of where it's going to either generate revenue or reduce revenue, then it kind of clicks a little bit more and makes sense of, yes, we do need to spend this money to protect this data because this data is important to our business operations.
Yeah. I think putting it in dollar signs often helps push that message through. This is where we're sort of pushing up against time. I want Lucy to come back to you for sort of final thought on this, because obviously you've been through this process from the sounds of different businesses. In terms of advice for folks out there, folks listening to the webinar, watching the webinar, who are trying to work out where to start with their intellectual property. Maybe they're starting at an early point, or they want to refresh their kind of audit of it. Have you got any sort of advice or hints for them to how to go about that?
Yeah, so obviously, let's take, for example, confidential information. It's always, before you even say you come to a solicitor like me, it's important to do just a sense check, like what is the valuable information? What do you not want anyone else to get their hands on that's part of your business? That's a really important first step in the process. And then obviously, as your lawyers, as part of my practice, I'd be able to complete, say, for example, an audit and advise you as to what you have and where, potentially you could gain better protection. So, classic thing, if you have a business and you don't have a trademark, for example, if you're collaborating with third parties and you don't have an NDA in place, or the NDA that you have isn't fit for purpose. So, for example, I know sometimes parties have collaborated and, the NDA either doesn't cover what's being discussed, or you might have a situation where it only protects the other side's information. It's a one-way rather than a two-way NDA. All these different things need to be looked at. But then in terms of like practical steps, and about protecting that IP, you can look to putting in place policies, training your employees, like your workplace, and just taking practical measures like engaging the companies and the guys that are on this call, for example, to put the wrappers of protection, the measures around your business. And I would say there's also other things, like, for example, as part of my practice at JMW, we have a product called JM Watch, where we can keep an eye on trademark registries throughout the world, because if someone's going to copy your business, often the first thing they'll do is they'll set up a website with a similar name, and it can alert us to that. And then it's all about speed. It's all about, identifying the threat and quickly clamping down on it, because if the sooner you can do that, the better. And likewise with an exiting employee, for example, if you have the ability through your policies to monitor devices, especially with people working from home on their own devices, that's really like quite important. And for example, if you can take a screenshot of their device so you can see what activities they've been undergoing, if they've been, doing these mass data transfers, this is all very helpful information. And again, as an IP specialist, there are specialist courts, for example, that are specifically designed for dealing with like breach of confidential information claims. That's the Intellectual Property Enterprise Court, small and medium-sized enterprise. It's all about, doing as much as you can to understand what you have, protect it, monitor it, and act quickly. Those would be my top tips.
All right, good top tips. I like those. It's just neat, brings us neatly to the end of that chat. Really interesting stuff. Thanks all to all of you. I want to thank our lovely guest, Danny Dresner, Professor of Cybersecurity, University of Manchester, Josh Shura-Copeland, Cybersecurity Director, AT&T, Lucy Marlowe, Intellectual Property Senior Associate, JMW Solicitors LLP, and of course Steve Audsley, EMEA Solution Engineering Manager for Data Protection at Fortra. Apologies, Steve, I've just noticed on our website we missed the E out of protection in your job title. Unforgivable. I shall make sure that whoever was responsible, possibly me, is fired. Thank you for joining us all. Of course, our Tice Goblins reminded me that we will be live in London. This is coming up next month, 23rd of Feb, live in London. Do get your tickets on the Tice website. It'd be fantastic to see you all in person. Next week, we're going down to once weekly with Tice Talk. So it's just going to be Thursdays from now on. Next week, I'll be talking about threat trends in 2023 and beyond, how uncertain times affect cyber risk. A good panel of that for that as well. Fantastic. Look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Have a great weekend. Thanks, Danny, Steve, Josh, Lucy. Have a great weekend, all of you. We can see you again on another Tice Talk. Cheerio. Bye.